Tonight we're drifting back, way back, to ancient Greece. Picture this. It's not all gleaming bronze armor and dramatic last stands on windswept cliffs. Instead, imagine a warm afternoon, the scent of wild thyme in the air, the distant bleating of goats, and the low murmur of voices from a sun-drenched courtyard. Forget the six-pack abs chiseled from constant warfare for just a moment. Honestly, if you were dropped into the average Greek Tuesday, you probably wouldn't survive the distinct lack of Wi-Fi, let alone the questionable plumbing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to see where you're all tuning in from, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're probably picturing spears, shields, and a lot of shouting, aren't you? Maybe some very serious men in very short tunics discussing democracy with furrowed brows before heading off to repel an invasion. That's the highlight reel, the version that makes for thrilling cinema and stirring tales. And don't get me wrong, those moments happened. But they weren't the whole story, not by a long shot. For every hero charging into battle, there were thousands of others just living, mending a fishing net, haggling over the price of figs, complaining about the summer heat, or perhaps just enjoying a quiet moment under an olive tree. The truth is, the ancient Greek world was far more varied and, dare I say, far more mundane than Hollywood often portrays. Those chiseled physiques you see in movies? Mostly artistic license. Darling. More likely a sturdy farmer's build from honest toil in the fields, or perhaps a philosopher's distinguished paunch developed after one too many evenings spent at a symposium, reclined on a couch, wine cup in hand, solving the universe's problems one sip at a time. The ancient Greeks were, after all, human. They worried about their children, their harvests, and whether their neighbor was secretly diverting water from the communal spring. You know, the usual. Our understanding of ancient Greece is often filtered through the grandest, most dramatic narratives that survived, the epic poems of Homer, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, the tragedies of Sophocles. These are incredible, vital sources, but they naturally gravitate towards the extraordinary: wars, political upheavals, divine interventions. It's like trying to understand modern life by only watching action movies and news reports about global summits. You'd get a very skewed, very exciting, but ultimately incomplete picture. You wouldn't see the quiet hours, the daily routines, the small acts of kindness or pettiness that make up the bulk of human experience. Think about the sheer scale of the Hellenic world. It wasn't just Athens and Sparta locked in an eternal stare-down, though they certainly had their moments. There were hundreds of independent city-states, or polis, scattered across mainland Greece, the Aegean Islands, the coast of Asia Minor, southern Italy, and even further afield. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that while Athens and Sparta were undeniably influential, they represented just two models of Greek life. Many other polis were smaller, perhaps more agricultural, focused on trade, or content with their local affairs, their citizens more concerned with the price of olive oil than the latest pronouncements from the Athenian assembly. Corinth, Thebes, Argos, Miletus, each had its own character, its own rhythm. Sparta, bless their laconic hearts, were the overachievers of angst, the military academy poster boys. Their whole society was notoriously geared towards military discipline and austerity, a system that fascinated, and sometimes horrified, other Greeks. But they were the exception, the outlier, not the template for all Hellenic existence. Everyone else? Mostly just trying to get their olives pressed on time and hoping the gods were in a good mood. Historians still argue whether the focus on Athenian and Spartan conflicts in ancient texts truly reflects the daily preoccupations of most Greeks across the Hellenic world, or if it's a bias of the surviving literature, a sort of ancient clickbait focusing on the most dramatic events. Imagine if our entire civilization was judged in 2000 years solely on reality TV show conflicts and superhero movie plotlines. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? You'd miss the quiet poetry slams, the breakthroughs in sustainable farming, the hours spent perfecting a sourdough starter. So, let's try to peer behind that curtain of bronze and marble. Let's imagine you, not as a hoplite warrior or a famed orator, but as an ordinary person. You wake not to the sound of a battle horn, but perhaps to the crowing of a rooster, or the distant calls of fishermen heading out to sea. The air is cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke from a nearby hearth or the salty tang of the Aegean. Your concerns for the day might revolve around mending a leaky roof, ensuring your children learn their letters, or at least how to behave, or preparing for a local religious festival, events that fostered community rather than conflict. Even in times of war, which were unfortunately frequent in certain periods and regions, life had to go on for those not on the front lines. Fields needed to be tilled, goods exchanged, families cared for. And there were mechanisms for peace, too. One quirky but significant tidbit is the Ekakyria, the sacred Olympic truce. Every 4 years, messengers would travel throughout the Greek world proclaiming a cessation of hostilities, allowing athletes, artists, and pilgrims to travel safely to Olympia for the Games. It was a remarkable, if temporary, commitment to peace, a recognition that some things were more important than the endless squabbles between states. Imagine their biggest daily drama being whether the neighbor's goat ate your tunic, not whether your Instagram story got enough likes. Simpler times, perhaps, though with considerably scarier laundry detergents, or lack thereof. The idea isn't to say ancient Greece was a utopia. Far from it. There was hardship, inequality, and yes, brutal conflict. But it's to suggest that peace, in the sense of daily life continuing with a degree of predictability and communal rhythm, was more prevalent than the sagas of war might lead us to believe. It was in the quiet cultivation of land, the hum of the marketplace, the shared laughter at a festival, the dedication of an artist to their craft. These are the softer, often overlooked, threads in the rich tapestry of ancient Greek life. And as we journey on, we'll try to pick out more of these peaceful patterns, finding a surprising serenity in a world so often defined by its clamor. You stir, not to the blare of an alarm clock, thank Zeus, but to the gentle insistence of dawn filtering through the unglazed window opening or perhaps a gap in the wooden shutters of your oikos, your home. The air inside is still cool from the night, carrying the faint, earthy scent of clay, wool, and perhaps the lingering aroma of last night's olive oil lamp. Your bed is likely a simple wooden frame with woven leather straps or ropes supporting a mattress stuffed with wool, straw, or even dried seaweed if you live near the coast. It's not exactly a memory foam serta, but after a long day, it does the trick. You probably wouldn't rate it 5 stars on Ancient Airbed and Breakfast, but it's home. The typical Greek house, especially outside the very wealthy echelons, wasn't a sprawling marble villa. Think more along the lines of a modest, functional dwelling, often built around a central courtyard. This courtyard was the heart of the home, open to the sky, allowing light and air to circulate. It was here that much of daily life unfolded, shielded from the public gaze of the street. Walls were often made of sun-dried mud brick on a stone foundation, surprisingly good insulation, though perhaps not ideal in an earthquake, which, geologically speaking, was always a possibility in Greece. You might hear the cooing of doves kept for eggs or as pets, or the clucking of chickens, a common sight in many courtyards, scratching for scraps. As you rise, you might splash your face with water from a clay basin. Personal hygiene was important, though your morning routine wouldn't involve a 20-step skincare regimen. A bit of water, maybe rubbing yourself down with some olive oil, the ancient Greek equivalent of an all-purpose moisturizer, cleanser, and, if you were an athlete, sunblock mixed with a bit of dust for that authentic, just wrestled a demigod glow. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from ancient Egypt? The Greeks were a bit more sensible, sticking mostly to oil, though sometimes perfumed. Your clothing is simple and practical. A chiton, a tunic made from a single rectangular piece of linen or wool, draped and pinned at the shoulders and belted at the waist. No complex buttons or zippers to contend with, just a few well-placed fibulae, pins, and you're good to go. Men's chitons were typically shorter, knee-length, allowing for ease of movement, while women's often reached the ankles. Over this, if it's cool, you might throw on a himation, a larger rectangular cloak, draped artfully, or not so artfully, depending on your personal style and how awake you are. Getting the folds of your himation just right could be a minor daily challenge, a bit like trying to fold a fitted sheet today. Some people just had the knack. The sounds of the household are beginning to stir. Perhaps the rhythmic thump-thump of a slave grinding grain with a mortar and pestle, or the softer whir of a loom if the women of the household are early risers. If you're in a more prosperous home, enslaved people would be undertaking many of the morning chores, fetching water from the public fountain, a daily and often social task, tending the hearth fire, and preparing the morning meal. Historians still argue whether the ubiquity of slavery in ancient Greece fundamentally shaped the peaceful nature of citizen life by freeing them from much manual labor, or if it simply created a different, underlying tension within society. It's a complex issue with no easy answers, a shadow that hangs over even the sunniest depictions of daily Greek life. Breakfast, or akritisma, is a light affair. Often just some bread, barley bread for most, wheaten bread for the better off, dipped in undiluted wine. Yes, wine for breakfast. It wasn't about getting tipsy before your morning commute to the agora. The wine was often watered down for daily consumption, and this was a quick, energy-boosting start to the day. Sometimes there might be figs or olives alongside the bread. No sugary cereals or elaborate brunch spreads here. Just simple sustenance to get you going. Your children, if you have them, might be chasing each other around the courtyard already, their laughter echoing off the walls, or perhaps they're still sleepy, grumbling as they're coaxed into their own miniature chitons. Quirky tidbit about Greek homes: they were often surprisingly bare by modern standards. Furniture was minimal: couches, clini, for reclining during meals or symposia, small tables, chests for storage, and perhaps a few stools or chairs. Decoration might come from painted pottery, woven wall hangings, or perhaps a small household shrine dedicated to Hestia, goddess of the hearth, or other personal deities. The emphasis was on functionality and the life lived within the spaces, rather than an accumulation of possessions. There was a certain minimalist chic to it, long before it became a trend. It makes you wonder if Marie Kondo had a past life in ancient Athens, joyfully discarding anything that didn't spark eudaimonia. The layout of the house often separated men's and women's quarters, the andron and the gynekonitis, respectively, especially in more traditional or affluent households. The andron, typically located near the entrance, was the men's social space, where the master of the house would entertain guests. The gynekonitis was deeper within the house, a more private area for the women, children, and household tasks like weaving. This division reflected societal norms, but it also meant that the women's world, while perhaps less public, was a vibrant and essential hub of domestic activity and influence, a peaceful core around which the family revolved. The gentle rhythm of your home in the morning is a stark contrast to the clash of hoplite shields. It's a rhythm built on routine, on the known and the familiar. The smell of baking bread, the clatter of pottery, the murmur of voices discussing the day's tasks, these are the quiet, persistent sounds of life, far removed from the roar of battle. It's a peace born not of treaties or grand pronouncements, but of the simple shared experience of waking to another day, of tending to the needs of body and home, a fundamental human constant that echoes across the millennia. This domestic tranquility, this predictable pattern of morning, was the foundation upon which the more public and often more turbulent aspects of Greek life were built. And as the sun climbs higher, you prepare to step out, perhaps not to face down a Persian fleet, but to engage in the equally vital, if less sung, activities of your community. Now, let's talk about food, because if there's one thing that unites humanity across time and culture, it's the pursuit of a decent meal. And while you might associate Spartan cuisine with that legendarily unappetizing black broth, a delightful concoction of blood, pork, salt, and vinegar that one Sybarite famously declared made him understand why Spartans didn't fear death, the wider Greek world had a much more palatable and, frankly, enjoyable approach to eating. For most Greeks, life wasn't a constant culinary boot camp. Feasting, or at least eating well, was a significant part of life, a source of daily pleasure and a cornerstone of social interaction. Your typical diet, if you weren't a Spartan warrior trying to prove a point, revolved around what historians call the Mediterranean triad: cereals, olives, and grapes. Bread, as we mentioned, was a staple, usually barley bread, sometimes wheat. Olives were a gift from Athena herself, or so the Athenians believed, and they were eaten cured, of course, but more importantly, pressed for olive oil. This liquid gold was everything: a cooking medium, a sauce, a dressing, a fuel for lamps, a skin moisturizer, and even a soap substitute. You could probably run a small car on it if they'd had cars. The Greeks loved their olive oil, and it formed the fatty, flavorful base of many meals. Grapes, naturally, meant wine. Wine was consumed daily by most people, though almost always diluted with water, often in a special mixing vessel called a crater. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, the mark of someone who clearly didn't understand civilized living. It was the ancient equivalent of chugging syrup. Just not done, darling. Beyond the triad, your meals would be supplemented with a variety of other good things. Vegetables were plentiful: lentils, chickpeas, beans, especially fava beans, onions, garlic, leeks, cabbage, lettuce, and cucumbers. Think hearty stews, simple salads dressed with oil and vinegar, or vegetables cooked with herbs like oregano, thyme, and rosemary, which grew wild across the Greek countryside. Fruit was also a common treat, especially figs, fresh in summer, dried in winter, along with pomegranates, apples, pears, and berries. Honey was the primary sweetener, used in cakes and desserts, and to make mead. You wouldn't find refined sugar in your pantry. A honey cake was peak sweetness. Meat was less of a daily staple for the average person than it often is today, more of a treat or something enjoyed at festivals after a sacrifice. When meat was eaten, it was often goat or mutton. Pork was also popular, and poultry like chicken and geese were raised. Beef was less common, as cattle required more pasture land than was readily available in much of Greece. Hunting might provide wild boar, deer, or hare. But fish and seafood were hugely important, especially for coastal communities. Tuna, mackerel, sardines, anchovies, sea bass, red mullet. The Aegean was a generous provider. Octopus and squid were delicacies, and shellfish like mussels and oysters were also enjoyed. Imagine a fisherman returning with his catch, the silver scales gleaming in the sun, the promise of a fresh, grilled dinner. That's a peaceful, satisfying image. One mainstream historical fact is the Greek Symposium. This wasn't just a boozy party, though wine certainly flowed. It was a structured social gathering for aristocratic men, a cornerstone of intellectual and social life. After the main meal, guests would recline on couches, drink wine, mixed in that crater by a designated master of ceremonies, engage in conversation, listen to poetry or music, and sometimes enjoy the company of entertainers. It was a forum for discussion, debate, and bonding, fueled by good food and wine, a far cry from a battlefield. Philosophers tested their ideas, poets recited their latest works, and political alliances were sometimes forged in these convivial settings. Of course, you had to be a man of a certain social standing to attend. Sorry, ladies, and most of the blokes, too. Now for a quirky tidbit about Greek food. They were surprisingly fond of cheese. All sorts of cheese, mostly from goats or ewe's milk. Soft fresh cheeses, hard aged cheeses, even a form of cottage cheese. There's a passage in Homer's Odyssey where the Cyclops Polyphemus is described as a shepherd making cheese, pressing the whey from baskets of curds. So, your ancient Greek cheese board could have been quite respectable. Perhaps not a stinky blue, but definitely a good feta. It makes you wonder if they had ancient equivalents of wine and cheese Wednesdays. Probably, but with more lyre music and less complaining about work emails. Food preparation was generally done by the women of the household, or by enslaved cooks in wealthier families. Cooking methods were simple: grilling over charcoal, boiling in pots, baking in clay ovens. They didn't have elaborate spice racks filled with exotic ingredients from far-flung empires, relying instead on locally available herbs and the inherent flavors of fresh produce. Simplicity was key. A piece of grilled fish with a squeeze of lemon, if lemons had reached them in quantity yet, that's debated, and a drizzle of olive oil, some bread, some olives, a cup of wine, that's a meal that speaks of sunshine and sea, not strife and siege. Historians still argue whether the average Greek diet provided adequate nutrition by modern standards, particularly regarding protein intake for the poorer classes. While the elite certainly ate well, the daily fare of a humble farmer or laborer might have been more monotonous and less rich in animal protein. However, the emphasis on legumes, vegetables, and whole grains, along with olive oil, aligns surprisingly well with what we now consider a healthy Mediterranean diet. Perhaps they were onto something without even realizing it, too busy enjoying their figs to worry about macronutrients. Imagine the scene at a family meal. Gathered in the courtyard or a simple dining area, sharing food from communal dishes. The conversation might be about the day's events, neighborhood gossip, or plans for an upcoming festival. Children might be sneaking olives when they think no one is looking. It's a scene of domestic peace, of nourishment for both body and spirit. Even larger public feasts, often connected to religious celebrations, were about community and shared abundance. The aroma of roasting meat, the sound of music and laughter, the sight of people sharing food and wine, these were expressions of a society that, for all its famed warriors, also knew how to savor the simple, good things in life. The quiet satisfaction of a full belly and good company is a universal pleasure, and the ancient Greeks, outside of Sparta's mess halls, certainly understood its value. It's a delicious counterpoint to the narratives of endless conflict. Leaving the quiet sanctuary of your home, you step out into the bustling heart of your polis, the agora. This isn't just a marketplace in the narrow sense of buying and selling, though plenty of that happens. The agora is the civic, social, and commercial hub of the city, an open space typically located near the center, often shaded by porticos or colonnades where you can escape the Mediterranean sun. It's where you go to see and be seen, to catch up on the news, number 24-hour news channels here, just word of mouth and the occasional public notice inscribed on a stone, to conduct business, and yes, to do your shopping. The air here is thick with 1,000 different smells: baking bread from a nearby stall, pungent spices if your city is a trading hub, the metallic tang of a blacksmith's forge, the sweet scent of flower garlands sold for offerings or adornment, and perhaps the less romantic but equally present aroma of donkey droppings. It's a symphony, or perhaps a cacophony, of daily life. You navigate through a crowd of people. Citizens in their chitons and himatiants, some hurrying with purpose, others lingering to chat. Enslaved people running errands for their masters, carrying baskets or jars. Perhaps a foreigner, an Egyptian merchant or a Phoenician sailor, distinguished by their dress and language, a reminder that your Greek city, especially if it's a port like Corinth or Athens, is connected to a wider world. You might see a philosopher like Socrates if you're in Athens at the right time, engaging a group of young men in a lively, and likely frustrating for them, discussion in a quiet corner. Remember those leisurely philosophical pursuits we touched on? The agora was often their open-air classroom. The stalls are varied and vibrant. One vendor sells pottery, simple, functional amphorae for storing wine and oil, beautifully painted craters for mixing wine at symposia, and smaller cups and bowls for daily use. Another offers textiles, bolts of linen and wool, perhaps some dyed in vibrant colors, though purple, derived from the murex snail, would be incredibly expensive, reserved for the very wealthy or for sacred purposes. You might haggle over the price of a new pair of sandals from a leatherworker, the scent of tanned hides sharp in the air. There are tables piled high with fresh produce brought in from the countryside, gleaming olives, pyramids of figs, bunches of grapes, fragrant herbs. A fishmonger proudly displays the morning's catch on a marble slab, keeping it cool with damp cloths. You can hear the rhythmic clang of a coppersmith's hammer, shaping a new pot or repairing an old one. It's a place of skill, of craftsmanship, of goods changing hands not through conquest, but through commerce and agreement. One mainstream historical fact is that the agora wasn't just for informal commerce, it also housed important public buildings. You might find the Bouleuterion, where the city council met, or the Tholos, a round building where council members might dine at public expense. Law courts were often located in or near the agora. So, amidst the buying and selling, the serious business of governance and justice also took place, a constant reminder of the civic order that underpinned this bustling activity. This blend of commerce, politics, and social life made the agora uniquely Greek, a true center of the community. Now for a quirky tidbit about the agora. Official weights and measures were often kept there, sometimes prominently displayed, to ensure fair trade. Imagine a public official, an agoranomos, whose job it was to inspect goods, check weights, and settle disputes between buyers and sellers. They were the ancient trading standards officers, ensuring you weren't getting ripped off on your barley flour or your wine. It's a small detail, but it speaks to a desire for order and fairness in daily transactions, a peaceful regulation of commerce that benefits everyone. You probably wouldn't want to argue with the agoranomos. They likely had the ancient Greek equivalent of a very stern clipboard and no patience for shifty fig sellers. The sounds of the agora are a key part of its atmosphere. The chatter of a dozen conversations in different accents, the calls of vendors advertising their wares, fresh figs, sweet as honey, the laughter of children darting between the stalls, probably being told off by their mothers, the occasional braying of a donkey laden with goods. It's a lively, human soundscape. There's an energy here, a vibrancy that comes from people interacting, exchanging not just goods but also news, opinions, and gossip. Historians still argue whether the level of peace in the agora was uniform across all social classes, or if the visible poverty of some, contrasted with the wealth of others, created underlying tensions that are not always apparent in the idealized descriptions. Certainly, pickpockets and minor disputes were likely as common then as in any busy market today. You might stop to listen to a herald reading out a new decree from the city council, or perhaps a rhapsode reciting passages from Homer for an appreciative crowd. The agora was a place of information dissemination, long before newspapers or the internet. It was where you learned what was happening in your city and in the wider Greek world. Maybe you overhear a heated discussion about the latest political scandal or the prospects for the upcoming olive harvest. It's all part of the daily flow of information and opinion that knitted the community together. The commercial transactions themselves were generally peaceful. Haggling was expected, a part of the dance between buyer and seller, but it was usually good-natured. Coinage, with its city-specific emblems, the Athenian owl, the Corinthian Pegasus, facilitated trade, a tangible symbol of your city's identity and economic reach. You might pay with a few bronze chalkoi or a silver obol or drachma. The system wasn't always standardized across Greece, which could make intercity trade a bit like trying to use arcade tokens in a vending machine, but within your own polis, it worked. The marketplace, then, wasn't a battleground of fierce competition in the modern cutthroat sense. It was more of a communal space where needs were met, skills were showcased, and the economic lifeblood of the city pulsed steadily. It was a place of surprisingly orderly interactions, governed by custom and, where necessary, by officials like the agronomos. The gentle hum of commerce, the daily dance of buying and selling, the craftsmanship on display, these are all testament to a society that valued the peaceful exchange of goods and services as a fundamental part of its existence. This daily rhythm of the agora, full of sound and life, was a far cry from the silence of a battlefield after the fighting is done. Beyond the daily grind of home and market, your life as an ancient Greek is punctuated by something truly special: festivals. And we're not talking about a long weekend with a barbecue. Greek festivals, or hiortai, were deeply woven into the fabric of society, numerous and varied, dedicated to specific gods and goddesses, celebrating harvests, commemorating historical events, or simply providing an outlet for communal joy and religious devotion. These were not solemn, hushed affairs, though some rituals certainly had their moments of gravity. More often, they were vibrant, exuberant explosions of color, music, feasting, and performance, bringing the entire community together in a shared experience that transcended the everyday. Imagine the city transformed. Streets that are usually just thoroughfares might be decorated with garlands and ribbons. The air, normally filled with the sounds of commerce, now thrums with music. The piercing notes of the aulos, a double reed pipe, the strumming of the lyre, the rhythmic beat of drums. Processions, or pampa, are a key feature. You might find yourself part of a long line of citizens, dressed in your best clothes, perhaps carrying offerings, winding your way through the city towards a sacred precinct or temple. Young men on horseback, priestesses in elaborate robes, elders carrying sacred objects, even animals destined for sacrifice, all moving together in a choreographed display of civic and religious unity. One of the most famous examples, a mainstream historical fact, is the Panathenaea in Athens. Held every year, with a grander Great Panathenaea every 4 years, it honored Athena Polias, the city's patron goddess. The festival culminated in a magnificent procession that carried a newly woven peplos, a robe, to the Acropolis to adorn the ancient wooden statue of Athena. The Parthenon frieze, if you've ever seen images of it, is believed by many scholars to depict this very procession, a stunning artistic record of communal devotion. The festival also included athletic contests, musical competitions, poetry recitations, and even a boat race. It was a multi-day extravaganza that involved practically everyone in the city, a huge display of Athenian pride and piety. You might spend days looking forward to it, preparing, anticipating the spectacle and the break from routine. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some festivals involved ritualized jesting or even insults, known as iskrologia or Jephorismus. During certain processions, particularly those associated with Demeter and Dionysus, participants, especially women, might shout obscenities or mock bystanders, including prominent citizens. Far from being offensive, this was considered a ritual element, perhaps to ward off evil spirits, promote fertility, or simply to blow off some steam in a socially sanctioned way. Imagine being able to good-naturedly roast the mayor during a parade without getting arrested. The Greeks, it seems, understood the therapeutic value of a well-aimed jibe, especially when divinely approved. It's like an ancient version of a celebrity roast, but with more sacred undertones and possibly fewer lawyers involved. Feasting, as we've touched upon, was a central part of most festivals. After the sacrifices, the meat of the sacrificed animals, usually oxen, goats, or sheep, would be distributed and cooked, providing a rare treat of plentiful meat for many ordinary citizens. Large public banquets were held, where people ate and drank together, fostering a sense of community and shared abundance. Wine flowed freely, still diluted mostly, one hopes, and the atmosphere would be merry and convivial. These feasts weren't just about filling your belly. They were about reaffirming social bonds, sharing in the gods' bounty, and experiencing collective joy. Athletic competitions were also a huge draw, and not just at the famous Pan-Hellenic Games like the Olympics. Many local festivals included their own games: foot races, wrestling, boxing, javelin, discus, and chariot races if the city had a hippodrome and enough wealthy citizens to field teams. You'd cheer for your local heroes, perhaps place a friendly wager, though serious gambling was often frowned upon. These contests were a celebration of physical prowess, a way to honor the gods who delighted in human excellence, and a thrilling spectacle for everyone. Historians still argue whether the intense competitiveness of Greek games, even at local levels, truly fostered peace by channeling aggression, or if it sometimes exacerbated rivalries between individuals or communities. It's likely a bit of both, a healthy outlet that could occasionally boil over, much like a modern football match. Dramatic performances were another key element of many festivals, especially the city Dionysia in Athens. This was where the great tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and the comedies of Aristophanes, were first performed. Imagine sitting in a vast open-air stone theater, packed with thousands of your fellow citizens, watching masked actors bring myths and contemporary social satire to life. It was a deeply moving and thought-provoking experience, a form of communal catharsis and entertainment that was also considered a religious act, honoring Dionysus, the god of wine, theater, and ecstatic release. The state even provided a fund, the Theoricon, to help poorer citizens afford tickets, underscoring the importance of these shared cultural experiences. These festivals were more than just a day off work. They were the lifeblood of Greek communal identity, reinforcing shared values, religious beliefs, and social cohesion. They provided opportunities for everyone: men, women, citizens, sometimes even resident foreigners and slaves in certain roles, to participate in the life of the polis in a meaningful and joyful way. The planning, the anticipation, the shared rituals, the collective revelry, all of underscore it contributed to a sense of belonging and a rhythm of life that was profoundly peaceful in its regularity and inclusiveness. It was a time when the divisions of daily life might soften, and the community could experience itself as a unified whole, celebrating together under the watchful eyes of their gods. The laughter, the music, the shared awe at a perfectly executed choral ode, these are the sounds of a people at peace with themselves and their traditions, finding joy not in conquest, but in community. While grand public festivals punctuated the calendar with communal devotion, the religious life of an ancient Greek was also deeply personal, woven into the very fabric of your daily existence. You wouldn't just think about the gods during festival time. They were a constant presence, influencing everything from the weather to your health, from the success of your harvest to the safety of a sea voyage. This daily dance with the divine, far from being a source of constant anxiety, though a healthy respect, or eusebia, was crucial, often brought a sense of order, comfort, and personal connection to the cosmos. It was a quiet undercurrent of peace, knowing you were part of a larger, divinely ordered world. Your day might begin with a small, personal offering. Perhaps you pour a libation, a few drops of wine or milk, on your household altar or hearth, dedicated to Hestia, goddess of the home and hearth, asking for her blessing on your family and household for the day. Or you might burn a pinch of incense, the fragrant smoke carrying your prayers upwards. These small, simple rituals, performed without fanfare, were a way of acknowledging the gods' presence and seeking their favor in the mundane activities of life. It wasn't about complex theology, it was about maintaining a good relationship, a charis or reciprocal grace, with the powers that shaped your world. You did your part with offerings and respect, and you hoped they would do theirs by looking kindly upon you. The Greek pantheon, as you know, was a lively and often very human-like bunch. Zeus with his thunderbolts and roving eye, Hera his often jealous wife, Poseidon stirring the seas, Apollo with his lyre and prophetic wisdom, Artemis hunting in the forests, Aphrodite inspiring love and desire, Ares a little too fond of a good scrap, and Athena wise and strategic. But beyond these Olympian A-listers, there were countless other deities, nature spirits, local heroes, and minor gods who oversaw specific aspects of life. There were river gods, mountain nymphs, spirits of trees and springs. If you were a farmer, you'd be particularly mindful of Demeter, goddess of the harvest. If a sailor, Poseidon and the Dioscoroi, Castor and Pollux, protectors of sailors, would be high on your prayer list. This intricate web of divine beings meant that every part of your world was imbued with a sense of the sacred. A mainstream historical fact is the importance of oracles in Greek life. The most famous, of course, was the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi, where the Pythia, a priestess, would enter a trance and deliver cryptic pronouncements from the god. Individuals, and even entire city-states, would make the pilgrimage to Delphi to ask for guidance on important decisions, whether to go to war, found a colony, or even on personal matters like marriage or business ventures. While Delphi was preeminent, there were many other oracles throughout the Greek world, like the Oracle of Zeus at Dodona, where priests interpreted the rustling of leaves on a sacred oak tree. Seeking an oracle's advice was a way of trying to navigate an uncertain future, of aligning your actions with divine will, which in itself could be a source of reassurance, even if the advice was frustratingly ambiguous. Trying to interpret what a great empire will fall actually meant for your side could keep philosophers busy for weeks. Now for a quirky and rather charming tidbit. The Greeks often left small offerings called ex votos at shrines and temples. These were tokens of gratitude for prayers answered or vows fulfilled. If you recovered from an illness, you might dedicate a small clay or metal model of the afflicted body part, a leg, an eye, an ear, to Asclepius, the god of healing. These weren't necessarily grand or expensive, they were personal expressions of thanks. Archaeologists have found thousands of these, offering a poignant glimpse into the personal hopes, fears, and gratitude of ordinary people. Imagine a wall in a healing sanctuary covered in tiny clay ears, a testament to countless whispered prayers for relief from an earache and the subsequent peace of recovery. It's a very human, very relatable form of devotion. You didn't necessarily need a priest to interact with the gods in your daily life. While priests and priestesses presided over temple rituals and public sacrifices, personal prayer and offerings were things you could do yourself. However, piety also involved respecting sacred places. You wouldn't just barge into a temple precinct. There were often rules about ritual purity, perhaps needing to wash your hands and face, or refraining from certain activities beforehand. Groves of trees, springs, and even certain mountains could be considered sacred to particular deities, places where you would tread carefully and respectfully. This imbued the natural world around you with a deeper meaning, a sense of enchantment. Historians still argue whether the average Greek genuinely believed all the myths literally, with their often R-rated divine shenanigans, or if they viewed them more as allegorical tales or traditional stories that conveyed deeper truths about the world and human nature. It's likely a spectrum. Some probably accepted every tale as gospel, while others, particularly the philosophers, might have offered more metaphorical interpretations. But regardless of the literal belief, the underlying system of ritual, sacrifice, and respect for the divine order provided a framework for living, a way of making sense of a world that could often seem chaotic and unpredictable. That framework itself could be a source of profound psychological peace. Your relationship with the gods was largely transactional, but not necessarily in a cold, calculating way. It was more like maintaining a good relationship with powerful neighbors. You showed respect, offered gifts, sacrifices, libations, prayers, and hoped for their goodwill and protection in return. If things went wrong, a bad harvest, an illness, you might wonder which god you'd offended and try to make amends. But when things went well, when your child recovered from a fever, or your ship returned safely, the sense of gratitude and the feeling of being looked after by benevolent powers could be a deep source of contentment. So, your spiritual life isn't just about attending the big stadium-sized festivals. It's in the quiet prayer at your hearth, the respectful nod as you pass a small country shrine, the careful observance of sacred days, the hopeful consultation of an oracle, and the heartfelt thank you offering. It's a constant, low-humming dialogue with the unseen forces you believe shape your world. This ongoing conversation, this sense of being embedded in a divinely ordered cosmos, provided a profound, if often unstated, sense of peace and belonging for many ancient Greeks, a spiritual anchor in the often turbulent seas of life. Now, you might think philosophy in ancient Greece was all about bearded sages in dusty academies, lost in impenetrable arguments about the nature of being. And while there was certainly some high-level intellectual sparring happening, the reality is that philosophy, or the love of wisdom, was often a more accessible and, dare I say, leisurely pursuit than you might imagine. It wasn't confined to lecture halls. It spilled out into the agora, under the shade of porticos, and into the symposia we've already visited. For many, engaging with philosophical ideas wasn't a stressful academic requirement, but a stimulating and even enjoyable way to spend time, to understand the world, and to contemplate how best to live a good life, which often, at its core, meant a peaceful and fulfilling life. Imagine yourself strolling through Athens. You might see groups of young men clustered around an older, charismatic figure, not necessarily in a formal school setting, but simply conversing, questioning, exploring ideas. This was the environment in which Socrates famously operated, engaging passers-by in dialogue, challenging their assumptions, and urging them to know thyself. He didn't have a university office or a set curriculum. His classroom was the city itself. This kind of informal philosophical engagement was quite common. You didn't need a PhD to ponder the big questions. You just needed a curious mind and perhaps a shady spot to sit and chat. Maybe you wouldn't be debating the finer points of Plato's forms, but you might discuss the nature of justice with your friends after a market dispute, or consider what constitutes a virtuous citizen. The philosophical schools that did arise, like Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum, were often located in pleasant, park-like settings on the outskirts of the city. The Academy, for instance, was situated in a grove sacred to the hero Academos, a place with trees and presumably a bit of peace and quiet conducive to deep thought. Aristotle's Lyceum was known for its peripatos, or covered walkway, where he would often stroll while teaching, leading to his followers being called peripatetics, the walk-arounders. There's something inherently unhurried about learning while ambling under a colonnade, isn't there? It beats a stuffy lecture hall with flickering fluorescent lights any day. This connection with nature and movement suggests that philosophy wasn't seen as a purely abstract, disembodied activity, but one that benefited from a calm environment and even gentle physical activity. A mainstream historical fact is the sheer diversity of Greek philosophical thought. It wasn't a monolithic entity. You had the pre-Socratics, who were fascinated by the fundamental nature of the cosmos. What is everything made of? Is it water, air, fire, or some boundless stuff? Then came Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, whose ideas laid the foundations for much of Western philosophy. But alongside them, and after them, flourished other schools with very different approaches to achieving eudaimonia, or human flourishing, which often equated to a state of inner peace and contentment. The Stoics, for example, advocated for a life of virtue lived in accordance with nature and reason, emphasizing emotional resilience and acceptance of fate. The Epicureans, often misunderstood as hedonists, actually sought a modest, tranquil life, free from pain and fear, finding pleasure in simple things like friendship and philosophical contemplation. They literally preached the pursuit of ataraxia, a state of serene calmness. Now for a quirky, and rather relatable, philosophical tidbit. Diogenes the Cynic. If ever there was a philosopher who embodied a radical, almost aggressive pursuit of a simple, unconventional peace, it was Diogenes. He famously lived in a large ceramic jar, not a barrel, as often depicted, in the Athenian agora, rejecting all social conventions and material possessions. He owned only a cloak, a staff, and a cup, which he later threw away upon seeing a child drink from its hands. When Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the world, came to meet him and asked if there was anything he could do for him, Diogenes, who was sunbathing, supposedly replied, "Yes, stand out of my light." This wasn't just rudeness. It was a profound statement about finding contentment in the absolute minimum, free from the desires and anxieties that plagued most people. He was basically the ancient Greek version of a minimalist influencer, but with more philosophical street cred and significantly less sponsored content. The pursuit of philosophy wasn't just for an intellectual elite. While formal schooling in philosophy was limited, the ideas discussed often filtered out into the broader culture through public lectures. Plays, Aristophanes, for example, satirized Socrates, and general conversation. Concepts like virtue, justice, the good life, and the nature of the gods were topics that educated citizens would have been familiar with and likely discussed. The skills of rhetoric and argumentation, honed in philosophical training, were also valuable in the law courts and political assemblies, so there was a practical application that made philosophical education attractive to some. Historians still argue whether the intense intellectualism of Greek philosophy, with its emphasis on reason and logic, inadvertently contributed to a sense of detachment from the more emotional or spiritual aspects of life for some, potentially creating a different kind of inner unrest if a purely rational life proved unsatisfying. However, for many, philosophy offered tools for self-examination, for understanding the world, and for cultivating an inner state of tranquility. Think of Stoicism's practical exercises for managing emotions and focusing on what you can control. These are techniques that resonate even today in cognitive behavioral therapy. The goal was often not just abstract knowledge, but a way of living that led to peace of mind. Imagine yourself attending a public reading or lecture in a quiet stoa, the rhythmic cadence of the speaker's voice washing over you as they explore complex ideas. Or perhaps you're simply sitting with a friend, watching the sunset over the Aegean, discussing the meaning of a recent dream or the best way to raise your children according to virtuous principles. These are moments of intellectual engagement, yes, but also moments of quiet contemplation and connection, far removed from the clang of armor or the shouts of the battlefield. Philosophy, in its ancient Greek context, was often a path to understanding oneself and one's place in the universe, and that understanding could be a profound source of peace. It was a leisure activity with a purpose, a way to cultivate not just a sharp mind, but a serene spirit. Beyond the dialogues of philosophers and the pronouncements of oracles, ancient Greece hummed with another kind of peaceful pursuit, artistic creation. You're surrounded by it, not just in grand temples and public statues, but in the everyday objects that fill your home and your city. The creation and appreciation of art, in its myriad forms, was an integral part of Greek life, offering avenues for serene personal expression, shared communal beauty, and a deep connection to both the human and divine worlds. It wasn't just for the elite. Beauty and craftsmanship were valued across society. Think about the pottery we've already encountered in the agora and your home. Those clay vessels weren't just functional containers, they were canvases for an incredible array of painted scenes. You have the bold, geometric patterns of the earlier periods, giving way to the intricate black figure and red figure techniques that brought myths, heroic tales, and scenes of daily life to vivid, dynamic life. Imagine a potter at their wheel, a lump of wet clay spinning under their skilled hands, a form emerging as if by magic. Then the painter, with a fine brush, meticulously outlining figures, filling them with slip, incising details, a process requiring immense patience and precision. This quiet, focused work, often done in small workshops, resulted in objects that were both useful and beautiful, bringing art into the most mundane corners of life. You might sip your diluted wine from a cup adorned with dancing maenads or heroic exploits, a small, daily dose of artistry. Then there's sculpture. While we often associate Greek sculpture with those iconic, life-sized or colossal marble statues of gods and athletes, the skill was also applied on a smaller scale. You might have small bronze or terracotta figurines in your home, perhaps representing a household deity or a beloved animal. The creation of larger sculptures, of course, was a major undertaking, requiring a team of skilled artisans working under a master sculptor. Phidias, overseeing the Parthenon sculptures, is a prime example. The slow, careful chiseling of marble, the gradual emergence of a human or divine form from a block of stone, is an act of intense concentration and artistic vision. There's a profound peace in that kind of focused creation, a dialogue between the artist and the material. And for the viewer, encountering these idealized forms of beauty and strength could be an inspiring, even calming, experience. A mainstream historical fact is the Greek invention of theatrical drama, which we touched upon with festivals. But consider the artistry involved beyond the playwright's words. The masks worn by actors, often exaggerated and expressive, were works of art in themselves, crafted to convey character and emotion to the furthest rows of the vast amphitheaters. The costumes, the choreography of the chorus, the music that accompanied the performances, all these elements were carefully considered and artfully executed. The chorus, in particular, with its synchronized movement and sung odes, was a powerful artistic force, their performance a blend of dance, poetry, and music that could be mesmerizing. Imagine the hours of rehearsal, the dedication required to achieve that perfect unity. Now for a quirky artistic tidbit. The ancient Greeks were master gem cutters. They carved intricate designs, portraits, and mythological scenes onto small, semi-precious stones like carnelian, agate, and jasper. These engraved gems, or intaglios, were often set into rings and used as seals to stamp official documents or personal letters. The level of detail achieved on such a tiny scale, often less than an inch across, is astonishing. It required incredible eyesight, a steady hand, and miniature tools. Owning a beautifully carved signet ring was a mark of status, but also a tiny, portable work of art you carried with you, a little piece of serene craftsmanship in your pocket. It's like having a miniature museum exhibit on your finger. Music was an essential accompaniment to many aspects of Greek life. Religious ceremonies, festivals, symposia, athletic training, even manual labor. The lyre, the kithara, a more robust version of the lyre, and the aulos were the most common instruments. While much of ancient Greek music is lost to us, our system of musical notation is very different. We know from texts and depictions that it was highly valued and considered to have powerful ethical and emotional effects. Pythagoras, for example, famously explored the mathematical relationships between musical harmonies and believed music could soothe the soul. Imagine the gentle strumming of a lyre in a quiet courtyard at dusk, or the more energetic piping and drumming at a village celebration, music providing a soundtrack to both peaceful contemplation and joyful release. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation behind Greek artistic production was religious devotion, civic pride, personal expression, or simply a love of beauty for its own sake. It was likely a complex blend of all these things. Certainly, many of the grandest works were commissioned for temples or public spaces, intended to honor the gods and celebrate the polis. But the skill and care lavished on everyday objects suggest a deeply ingrained aesthetic sense, a desire to surround oneself with well-made and beautiful things, which itself contributes to a more pleasant and peaceful environment. Consider the weaver at her loom, patiently interlacing threads of wool or linen, creating patterns and textures. Or the fresco painter adorning the walls of a wealthy home or public building with vibrant scenes. Or the goldsmith crafting delicate jewelry. These are all acts of slow, meticulous creation, requiring focus, skill, and a vision. The workshop of an artist or craftsman, though perhaps noisy with the sounds of their trade, would also be a place of intense, peaceful concentration. The satisfaction of completing a well-executed piece, of bringing beauty into the world, is a profound and quiet joy. So, the artistic impulse in ancient Greece wasn't just about producing museum-quality masterpieces. It was about infusing daily life with beauty, skill, and meaning. It was about expressing communal values and personal piety through tangible forms. The quiet dedication of the artist, the shared appreciation of a beautiful object or a moving performance, these are all threads in the tapestry of a surprisingly peaceful existence, moments where the clamor of the world fades, replaced by the serene focus of creation or the calm contemplation of beauty. While the pursuit of art and philosophy nourished the mind and spirit, the ancient Greeks were also deeply concerned with the well-being of the body. This wasn't just about athletic prowess for the Olympic Games, it was about a more holistic approach to health, a desire for balance and harmony that permeated daily life. You'd find a surprising amount of attention paid to diet, exercise, hygiene, and even early forms of medical practice, all aimed at maintaining a state of physical wellness that contributed to an overall sense of peace and contentment. After all, it's hard to feel serene when your tooth is throbbing or your digestion is staging a rebellion. Exercise was a fundamental part of life, especially for men. The gymnasium, quite literally a place to be naked, as athletes typically trained nude, was a common feature in most Greek cities. But it wasn't just for professional athletes. It was a social and educational institution where men and older boys would gather not only for physical training, running, wrestling, javelin, discus, boxing, but also for conversation and intellectual pursuits. Philosophers sometimes taught in or near gymnasia. This combination of physical and mental exercise reflects the Greek ideal of a well-rounded individual, someone with a sound mind in a sound body. Imagine the scene, the rhythmic thud of feet on a running track, the grunts of wrestlers, the whir of a discus, all under the Mediterranean sun, followed by a cool wash and perhaps a stimulating discussion. It's a far cry from a modern, sterile gym experience. It was a communal activity, a part of one's civic duty to stay fit. Personal hygiene, as we've touched upon, was important. Public baths were common, especially in larger cities and later in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, though the early Greek emphasis was perhaps more on washing with water from basins and using olive oil. Scraping the oil, sweat, and dirt off the body with a curved metal instrument called a strigil was a common practice after exercise. While their understanding of germs was non-existent, the instinct for cleanliness was there. Keeping the body clean was seen as a mark of civilization and self-respect. You probably wouldn't find artisanal soap bars with lavender and activated charcoal, but they did their best with water, oil, and the occasional abrasive like sand or fuller's earth. Diet, as we explored earlier, played a role in their concept of health. The Mediterranean triad of grains, olives, and grapes, supplemented with vegetables, fruits, and some fish or meat, was generally considered a healthy way to eat. Thinkers like Hippocrates, the father of medicine, emphasized the importance of diet in preventing and treating illness. He famously said, "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." This idea that what you eat directly impacts your well-being was a cornerstone of Greek medical thought, a proactive approach to health rather than just waiting for sickness to strike. No ancient Greek fad diets involving only cabbage soup, thankfully. When illness did occur, you wouldn't just be left to your fate or the whims of an offended god, though that was also a consideration. The Greeks developed a sophisticated system of medical thought and practice. A mainstream historical fact is the rise of Hippocratic medicine, which centered on observation, prognosis, and the idea that diseases had natural, not supernatural, causes. The Hippocratic Oath, with its emphasis on ethical conduct for physicians, still resonates today. Doctors or iatroi would diagnose illnesses, prescribe treatments, often involving diet, rest, herbs, or gentle exercise, and perform surgeries when necessary. While their knowledge was limited by the lack of modern technology, their approach was remarkably rational and empirical for its time. One quirky, and perhaps slightly alarming, tidbit about Greek medicine is the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It was believed that health depended on these four bodily fluids being in balance. Illness occurred when one or more humors were deficient or in excess. Treatments, therefore, often aimed to restore this balance, sometimes through methods like bloodletting or inducing vomiting or purging. While this theory is now thoroughly debunked, it was a dominant medical paradigm for centuries and represented an attempt to create a systematic understanding of bodily functions and dysfunctions. You might not fancy being prescribed a course of induced sneezing to rebalance your phlegm, but it was all part of their quest for wellness. Healing sanctuaries, particularly those dedicated to the god Asclepius, were important centers for medical treatment. The most famous was at Epidaurus. People suffering from illnesses would travel to these sanctuaries, undergo purification rituals, and then sleep in a special dormitory called an abaton. It was believed that Asclepius would appear to them in dreams, either healing them directly or providing instructions for their cure, which priests would then help interpret. While this sounds purely faith-based, these sanctuaries were often located in beautiful, peaceful settings with clean air and water, and the regime often involved rest, healthy diet, and sometimes even theatrical performances or other entertainments. So, it was a kind of holistic spa-meets-hospital experience. Historians still argue whether the cures at Asclepia were primarily due to divine intervention, the placebo effect, the genuinely therapeutic environment, or the more practical medical advice dispensed by the priests who were often skilled observers of symptoms. Even without access to a grand Asclepian, you would have had local healers, herbalists, and midwives in your community. Women, in particular, often possessed extensive knowledge of medicinal plants and traditional remedies passed down through generations, caring for the health of their families. The concern for bodily well-being extended to public health in some ways too. Cities understood the importance of a clean water supply, with aqueducts and fountains being vital infrastructure. So, your ancient Greek life isn't just about avoiding hoplite spears. It's also about actively cultivating good health. It's the invigorating exercise at the gymnasium, the refreshing cleanse afterwards, the mindful choice of nourishing foods, and the availability of medical care, however rudimentary by our standards. This focus on physical well-being contributed to a sense of personal agency and a more peaceful existence. When your body is functioning well, when you feel strong and vital, the world simply feels like a more manageable and enjoyable place. The Greeks understood this connection, seeking a harmony not just in their art and philosophy, but within their very own skin. while the polis with its bustling agora, grand temples, and lively gymnasia was the vibrant heart of Greek civilization. It's crucial to remember that a significant portion of the population, perhaps the majority, didn't live within the city walls. Their lives unfolded in the chora, the agricultural countryside that surrounded and sustained the urban center. Here, far from the political debates and philosophical discourses, a different kind of peace reigned, one dictated by the slower, more ancient rhythms of nature, the changing seasons, and the timeless tasks of cultivating the land. If you were a farmer, a shepherd, or a rural craftsman, your world would feel both more expansive and more intimately connected to the earth. Imagine waking not to the sounds of the city, but to the crowing of a rooster, the bleating of sheep, or the gentle rustling of olive leaves in the morning breeze. Your home might be a simple farmhouse, built of stone or mud brick, perhaps with a small holding attached where you grow vegetables for your family and keep a few chickens or a goat. The air is cleaner, carrying the scent of damp earth, wild herbs, and flowering fruit trees. Your day is structured not by the pronouncements of a herald in the agora, but by the position of the sun. You rise early to make the most of the daylight, your tasks laid out by the demands of the season. Life in the countryside was hard work, no doubt. Plowing the often rocky Greek soil with a simple ard pulled by oxen, sowing seeds by hand, weeding under the hot sun, harvesting grain with a sickle, pruning vines, and painstakingly gathering olives one by one, these were labor-intensive tasks. But there's a unique satisfaction, a quiet peace, that comes from working directly with the land, from seeing the fruits of your labor grow and ripen. You are intimately aware of the weather patterns, the quality of the soil, the needs of your plants and animals. This deep connection to the natural world, while demanding, could also be profoundly grounding. The agricultural year provided a steady, predictable rhythm. Spring was for plowing and planting, summer for tending the growing crops and the grape harvest, a time of intense activity often culminating in joyful local festivals celebrating the new wine. Autumn was the season for the olive harvest, a crucial time for securing that all-important oil, followed by sowing winter grains. Winter was a quieter period, a time for mending tools, weaving, and perhaps enjoying the stores laid by from the harvests. This cyclical pattern, repeated year after year, generation after generation, provided a sense of continuity and stability, a stark contrast to the sometimes volatile political life of the cities. A mainstream historical fact is that Greek city-states were heavily reliant on their agricultural hinterlands for survival. The chora produced the food, the grain, wine, oil, fruits, and vegetables that fed the urban population. This made farmers and agricultural land incredibly valuable. Wars often involved ravaging the enemy's countryside, burning crops, and cutting down olive trees, a particularly devastating act, as olive trees take many years to mature, precisely because this struck at the enemy's ability to sustain itself. This underscores the fundamental importance of these peaceful, productive rural landscapes. Now for a quirky and rather idyllic tidbit. Beekeeping was a widespread and respected practice in the Greek countryside. Honey, as we know, was the primary sweetener, and beeswax was used for writing tablets, sealing, and various crafts. The image of a beekeeper, carefully tending to their hives, perhaps located in a fragrant field of thyme or wildflowers, is one of serene, patient industry. The intricate social order of the beehive even fascinated philosophers like Aristotle. It's a small detail, but it paints a picture of rural life that includes not just back-breaking labor, but also skilled, gentle pursuits that worked in harmony with nature. You probably wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of a swarm, but the golden honey was worth the risk. While rural life could be isolating at times, communities were still important. Villages and small hamlets dotted the countryside, and neighbors would often help each other during busy times like harvests. Local shrines and rural sanctuaries, dedicated to nature deities like Pan, the goat-footed god of shepherds and flocks. The nymphs, or local heroes, were centers for communal worship and festivals, distinct from the grand urban temples but no less significant to those who lived there. These smaller, more rustic celebrations would have had their own charm, perhaps involving simple feasts, music, and dancing, reinforcing local bonds and providing a welcome break from work. Historians still argue about the extent of economic disparity in the Greek countryside. While some images portray idyllic smallholders working their own land, there were also large estates owned by wealthy urban aristocrats and worked by tenant farmers or enslaved laborers. The reality was likely a mix, with varying degrees of prosperity and hardship. However, even for those who toiled for others, the rhythm of agricultural life, tied to the natural cycles, would have been a constant. Your connection to the land might be your most profound relationship. You understand its moods, its generosity, its demands. You watch the seasons change not just on a calendar, but in the color of the leaves, the behavior of the birds, the feel of the wind. There's a simplicity to this life, a focus on essential things: food, shelter, family, community, and the goodwill of the local gods who oversee the fertility of the earth. The political machinations of the distant city might seem like a faint echo here. Your concerns are more immediate, more tangible. Will there be enough rain? Will the goats stay out of the vegetable patch? Will the olive crop be good this year? This rural rhythm, this quiet partnership with the earth, was the peaceful bedrock for much of ancient Greek society. It was less glamorous than the life of a philosopher or a statesman, less dramatic than that of a warrior, but it was arguably more fundamental. The steady, unceasing work of cultivating the land provided not just sustenance, but a profound sense of place and purpose, a deep, quiet peace found in the turning of the seasons and the bounty of the earth. It's a peace that smells of soil and sunshine, far from the marble and debates of the polis. Now, we've talked a lot about the public lives of men, in the agora, the gymnasium, the symposium. But what about the other half of the population? The lives of women in ancient Greece, particularly in a city like Athens, were often lived more privately, largely within the confines of the oikos, or household. Yet, to dismiss their existence as merely quiet or inconsequential would be a profound mistake. Within their designated spheres, women wielded considerable influence, managed complex domestic economies, and played absolutely vital roles in religious life. Theirs was a world often characterized by a different kind of peace, the peace of a well-ordered home, the satisfaction of skilled craft, and the profound power of sacred duties. Your world, if you are an Athenian woman of respectable standing, is centered on the gynaikonitis, the women's quarters of the house. This area, often located on an upper floor or at the back of the house, was your domain. It was here that you would oversee the running of the household, manage supplies, care for young children, and, crucially, engage in weaving. Weaving was not just a chore. It was a highly valued skill, a mark of a good and industrious wife. The rhythmic clack of the loom, the patient interlacing of threads to create fabric for clothing, blankets, and tapestries, would have been a constant, soothing sound in many Greek homes. Imagine the satisfaction of transforming raw wool or flax into a finished textile, a tangible product of your skill and labor. This was a creative outlet, a way to contribute directly to the family's well-being and comfort. Remember that grand peplos woven for Athena at the Panathenea? That was the work of specially chosen aristocratic women and girls, a task of immense honor. Managing the household was a significant responsibility. You were, in essence, the chief operating officer of a small domestic enterprise. This involved budgeting, overseeing food stores, ensuring the grain, oil, and wine lasted, managing enslaved domestic workers if the household could afford them, and seeing to the health and early education of your children. While your husband might be out in the agora or the assembly, you were the guardian of the home fires, quite literally, ensuring Hestia's flame continued to burn. This careful stewardship of resources and people, though largely unseen by the public world, was essential for the smooth functioning of the family and, by extension, the polis. There's a quiet power in that, a peace that comes from competence and control over your immediate environment. Childbirth and child-rearing were, of course, central to a woman's life. This was a sphere almost exclusively managed by women, with midwives playing a crucial role. The risks were high, for both mother and child, but the successful birth of a healthy infant was a moment of immense joy and relief. The early years of a child's life, their nurturing, their initial education in societal norms and stories, were in your hands. This intimate bond, this shaping of the next generation, was a profound source of purpose, even if it came with its share of anxieties. The laughter of children in the courtyard, the quiet moments of storytelling or teaching, these are peaceful domestic scenes that formed the bedrock of family life. A mainstream historical fact is that, in most Greek city-states, Sparta being a notable exception with its more publicly active women, women had limited legal rights and could not participate directly in political life. They could not vote, own significant amounts of land independently, or represent themselves in court. Their legal guardian was typically their father, then their husband, then their son. This legal framework certainly constrained their public agency. However, this doesn't mean they were without influence or public roles entirely. One very quirky and significant area where women held prominent public positions was in religion. Many priesthoods, especially those dedicated to goddesses like Hera, Athena, Demeter, and Artemis, were held by women, often from aristocratic families. These priestesses could wield considerable authority and prestige. They managed temple affairs, presided over important rituals and festivals, and were respected figures in the community. The Pythia at Delphi, the most famous oracle in Greece, was always a woman. Think of the priestess of Athena Polias in Athens, a position of great honor, responsible for the cult of the city's patron goddess. Their sacred duties brought them into the public eye in a way that few other roles allowed, and their connection to the divine imbued them with a special status. The solemnity of a religious procession led by a revered priestess is an image of peaceful, ordered devotion. Historians still argue intensely about the true extent of women's agency and happiness within the confines of Greek society. Were they largely content with their roles, finding fulfillment in family, household management, and religious duties? Or did they chafe under the restrictions, their voices and ambitions stifled? The surviving evidence, mostly written by men, makes it difficult to get a clear picture of their inner lives. Plays like Euripides' Medea offer glimpses of female frustration and power, but how representative these are is debatable. It's likely there was a wide spectrum of experiences, just as there is in any society. Beyond the home and the temple, women did have social lives, though often separate from men's. They would visit female friends and relatives, attend certain festivals, some of which, like the Thesmophoria, were exclusively for women and involved secret rituals related to fertility, and participate in communal activities like fetching water from the public fountain, a daily task that also served as a social gathering point. Here, women could exchange news, gossip, and share concerns, creating their own networks of support and information. So, while the peaceful lives of Greek women might look different from those of men, they were not devoid of meaning, activity, or influence. The rhythmic work of the loom, the careful management of a household, the sacred duties of a priestess, the shared laughter at the fountain, these are all threads in their experience. It's a peace found in domestic order, in the creation of textiles that clothed and warmed, in the nurturing of families, and in the powerful connection to the divine. Their world, though often circumscribed, was essential. a quiet but powerful current running beneath the more visible, male-dominated surface of ancient Greek society. Now, let's shrink our focus down a bit, from the adult world of work, politics, and religion, to the often overlooked realm of childhood. What was it like to be a child growing up in ancient Greece? While their lives were certainly different from modern childhoods, no smartphones, no organized playdates in the park with helicopter parents hovering nearby, they were not devoid of joy, play, or the simple, carefree moments that define youth. In fact, the world of Greek children, with its unique games, toys, and early learning experiences, offers another lens through which to see the more peaceful, everyday side of this ancient civilization. From the moment you were born, your life was, of course, precarious. Infant mortality was high, but if you survived those perilous early years, your childhood would unfold primarily within the oikos, under the care of your mother and perhaps a nurse, who might be an enslaved woman. The early years were filled with the universal experiences of childhood, learning to walk, to talk, listening to stories. These stories wouldn't be from picture books, but oral tales, myths about gods and heroes, fables with talking animals, perhaps family histories. Imagine a child, wide-eyed, listening to a dramatic retelling of Hercules' labors or the cunning adventures of Odysseus, the flickering lamplight casting dancing shadows on the wall. This was entertainment, but also early education, instilling cultural values and a sense of their place in the world. Toys were simple but imaginative. Archaeologists have found numerous examples. Little girls played with dolls, often made of terracotta, wood, or wax, sometimes with jointed limbs so they could be posed. They might have miniature sets of furniture or pottery for their dolls, engaging in the same kind of imaginative domestic play that children do today. Boys played with toy chariots, horses, and perhaps miniature weapons, mimicking the adult world. Balls, made from inflated pig bladders or sewn leather stuffed with hair or feathers, were popular with both sexes. Hoops, which they would roll along with a stick, and spinning tops were also common. It's a charming thought, a Greek child in a simple chiton, laughing as they chase a hoop through a sunny courtyard. Much simpler than a virtual reality headset, and probably better for their step count. A mainstream historical fact is that formal schooling, for those who received it, primarily boys from reasonably well-off families, usually began around the age of 7. They would attend a private school run by grammatists to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. Writing was done on wax tablets with a stylus, the pointed end for inscribing letters, the flat end for smoothing the wax to erase. Papyrus was expensive and reserved for more permanent texts. They would also learn to recite poetry, especially Homer, which was considered fundamental to a good education. Physical education, as we've discussed, was also crucial, taking place in the paletra, wrestling school, or gymnasium. Girls, for the most part, did not receive this kind of formal public schooling, their education focusing on domestic skills learned at home, though some may have learned to read and write. Now for a quirky tidbit about ancient Greek childhood games. They played a game called knucklebones, astragaloi. These were the actual ankle bones of sheep or goats, which have a unique, irregular shape with 4 distinct sides. The game involved tossing a set of these bones and scoring points based on how they landed, similar to dice games but with more complex combinations. It was a game of chance and skill, popular with children and adults alike, and even used for divination sometimes. You can almost hear the clatter of knucklebones on a stone floor, followed by shouts of triumph or groans of dismay. It's a small, tangible link to the playful pastimes of these ancient children. Play wasn't just about toys and structured games. Children, like children everywhere, would have engaged in imaginative play, making up their own scenarios, exploring their surroundings within safe limits, and interacting with animals if they lived in a rural setting or a household with pets. They might help with simple household chores, learning by doing. The transition from childhood to adulthood was marked by different rituals for boys and girls. For boys, it might involve formally being enrolled as a citizen or beginning military training. For girls, marriage, often in their mid-teens to an older man, was the key transition. Historians still argue about the emotional experience of Greek childhood. Was it a happy, carefree time, or was it overshadowed by strict discipline and the early assumption of adult responsibilities? Again, the evidence is filtered, and experiences likely varied hugely based on social class, gender, and individual family dynamics. Some philosophical texts advocate for gentle, rational upbringing, while others suggest a sterner approach. What is clear is that children were valued, at least in the sense that they represented the future of the family and the polis. Religious festivals often included roles for children. Young girls might be chosen as a referoi, who performed secret rituals in connection with the cult of Athena Polias. Boys might participate in processions or sing in choirs. These experiences would have instilled a sense of religious duty and communal belonging from a young age. The sight of children, dressed in their festival best, participating in sacred rites, adds a touch of innocent charm to our image of these solemn occasions. So, while you might not see epic poems written about a game of knucklebones or the quiet world of dollhouse play, these were the everyday realities that shaped Greek children. Their laughter, their games, their early lessons, these were the peaceful foundations of their young lives. It's a reminder that even in a society famed for its warriors and philosophers, the simple joys and challenges of growing up were a constant, humanizing element. The shouts of children playing in a sunlit street, the quiet concentration over a wax tablet, the shared secrets between friends, these are the gentle, enduring sounds of childhood, echoing down to us from ancient Greece, a testament to the surprisingly peaceful and ordinary moments that made up so much of their lives. We've explored the personal, the domestic, the commercial, and the spiritual. But what about the broader framework that held all these individual lives together? Beyond the dramatic political confrontations and military campaigns, the Greek polis itself was, in many ways, an exercise in creating and maintaining a kind of civic peace and order. The goal, at least ideally, was eunomia, good order, good governance, a state where citizens could live their lives with a degree of predictability and security, contributing to and benefiting from a well-run community. This didn't happen by accident. It required conscious effort, shared responsibilities, and a set of institutions designed to foster harmony rather than constant strife. Your daily life is embedded within this civic structure. You are not just an individual. You are a citizen. If you are a free adult male born of citizen parents, that is a significant caveat in places like Athens. This citizenship comes with both rights and responsibilities. You might be called upon to serve as a juror in the law courts, to participate in the assembly where laws are debated and passed, or even to hold a minor public office, many of which were selected by lot in democratic Athens to ensure broad participation. This involvement, this sense of having a stake in the governance of your city, could foster a sense of belonging and shared purpose. It's your city, and you have a role in its smooth running, however small. The physical layout of the city itself often reflected this desire for order. The agora, as we've seen, was a central, organized space. Streets, while perhaps not always laid out in a perfect grid in older cities, still channeled movement and connected different parts of the polis. Public buildings, temples, council chambers, law courts, theaters were often impressive structures, symbols of civic pride and the importance of communal life. There was an understanding that the shared environment mattered, that a well-maintained city contributed to the well-being of its inhabitants. You probably wouldn't find a dedicated department of sanitation with garbage trucks doing weekly pickups, but there was a general expectation that public spaces should be respected. People didn't just toss their amphora shards into the middle of the agora with impunity, usually. One mainstream historical fact is the Athenian institution of the Boule, or Council of 500. Members were chosen by lot from the 10 tribes for a one-year term, and it was responsible for preparing the agenda for the assembly, managing finances, and overseeing the day-to-day administration of the city. This system of rotation and selection by lot aimed to prevent any one faction or individual from gaining too much power and to encourage wide citizen participation in governance. It was a remarkable experiment in direct democracy, and while messy and imperfect, it represented a commitment to a form of shared civic responsibility, a peaceful alternative to tyranny or oligarchy. Now for a quirky, but telling, civic tidbit. Many Greek cities had officials known as astynomoi, whose responsibilities included things like street maintenance and general public order within the city. They were like a combination of a building inspector, a minor public works manager, and perhaps a very low-key neighborhood watch coordinator. They might ensure that overhanging balconies weren't a hazard or that someone wasn't blocking a public thoroughfare with their market stall. It's not glamorous, but it speaks to a concern for the practicalities of urban living, for ensuring that the city functions smoothly and relatively peacefully for everyone. Imagine an astynomos patiently explaining to a citizen that, no, they really can't just build a goat pen in the middle of a public walkway. It's these small-scale enforcements of communal norms that keep daily life from descending into chaos. The concept of law was, of course, central to this civic order. From legendary lawgivers like Solon in Athens or Lycurgus in Sparta, though Lycurgus is a more shadowy, semi-mythical figure, Greeks understood that clearly defined laws, applicable to all citizens, were essential for a stable society. Law courts, where disputes were heard and justice administered, were a key feature of the polis. While the Athenian system of large citizen juries could sometimes be swayed by rhetoric or emotion, the ideal was that disputes should be settled through reasoned argument and legal process, rather than by private vendetta or violence. This commitment to the rule of law, however imperfectly realized, was a cornerstone of civic peace. Historians still argue whether the strong emphasis on civic duty and the collective good in many Greek polis genuinely fostered a harmonious society, or if it sometimes suppressed individual expression and dissent, creating an illusion of peace while masking underlying tensions. The pressure to conform, to put the city's interests above one's own, could be intense. And, of course, this civic order was built upon the exclusion of significant portions of the population, women, slaves, foreigners, from full participation. Their peace was often of a different, more constrained kind. Beyond formal institutions, there was also a strong cultural emphasis on moderation, sophrosyne, and avoiding hubris, arrogant pride or presumption, often leading to a downfall. These values, promoted in literature, philosophy, and public discourse, encouraged a kind of self-restraint and respect for limits, which are conducive to peaceful coexistence. The idea was that excessive ambition or disregard for others could disrupt the social fabric and invite divine retribution. So, there was a moral dimension to maintaining civic peace. Your participation in religious festivals, your contributions to public works, if you were wealthy, your respect for the laws and customs of your city, all these were part of being a good citizen, part of maintaining that eunomia. It wasn't always about grand heroic gestures. Often it was about the small, consistent actions that contributed to the overall well-being of the community. The peace of the polis was therefore not a passive state, but an active creation, a collective project. It was found in the orderly conduct of an assembly meeting, the fair judgment in a law court, the shared pride in a public building, and the general expectation that your fellow citizens would, for the most part, abide by the rules that allowed you all to live together in relative harmony. This civic peace, imperfect as it was, provided the stable backdrop against which the more personal and varied peaceful pursuits of ancient Greek life could flourish. So, what happened when the carefully constructed civic order we just discussed was threatened, not by an external enemy, but by internal disputes or individuals deemed problematic? While Greek history is certainly not short on civil strife and violent power grabs, there were also established, and sometimes surprisingly peaceful, mechanisms for resolving conflicts and dealing with troublesome citizens. The ideal often was to find solutions that restored harmony with minimal bloodshed, resorting to words and procedures rather than immediate violence. It's a testament to a society that, for all its warrior ethos, also valued structured, non-lethal ways of managing internal tensions. One of the most famous, and perhaps peculiar, of these mechanisms is a mainstream historical fact from Athens: ostracism. Once a year, Athenian citizens had the opportunity to vote to exile one prominent individual from the city for a period of 10 years. This wasn't a punishment for a specific crime. Rather, it was a way to defuse political tensions by removing someone whose power, ambition, or influence was considered a potential threat to the stability of the democracy. Each voter would scratch the name of their chosen candidate onto a potsherd, an ostracan, hence the name. If a quorum of 6,000 votes was cast, the person with the most votes had to leave Athens. They didn't lose their property, and they could return after 10 years with their citizenship intact. It was a kind of political safety valve, a way to have a no-fault divorce from a powerful figure before they could, say, attempt to become a tyrant. Imagine the annual tension, wondering if your name would be on enough ostraca to get you a decade-long involuntary vacation. Beyond such dramatic measures, the primary venue for resolving disputes was, of course, the law courts. We've touched on them before, but it's worth emphasizing their role in peaceful conflict resolution. If you had a disagreement with your neighbor over a boundary line, if someone owed you money and wouldn't pay, if you felt you had been slandered or assaulted, your first recourse, ideally, wasn't to gather your friends and have a brawl in the street. It was to bring a case before the courts. In Athens, these courts were typically composed of large juries of citizens, selected by lot, who would listen to speeches from both the accuser and the defendant, who usually spoke for themselves, though they might hire a speechwriter to craft their arguments. The jurors would then vote without deliberation. While this system had its flaws, susceptibility to rhetoric, potential for jurors to be uninformed or biased, it provided a formal, public, and largely non-violent way to address grievances. The very act of submitting your dispute to a third-party judgment, rather than taking matters into your own hands, is a step towards peaceful resolution. Now for a quirky legal tidbit. In some types of Athenian legal cases, particularly private disputes, there was a strong emphasis on arbitration and reconciliation before the matter even reached a full trial. Public or private arbitrators might be appointed to try and help the litigants reach a mutually agreeable settlement. The idea was that a negotiated solution, where both parties felt they had some say and perhaps made some concessions, was preferable to the win-or-lose outcome of a trial. This shows a pragmatic understanding that maintaining ongoing relationships within the community was often more valuable than achieving total victory in a legal battle. It's the ancient Greek equivalent of, let's try to talk this out over a cup of watered-down wine before we get the lawyers involved. Of course, not all disputes were handled so formally. In daily life, social pressure and community norms played a huge role in keeping the peace. If you were behaving in a way that was disruptive or offensive to your neighbors, you might find yourself quietly shunned, or perhaps an elder or respected community figure would have a word with you. Reputation, Cleos for heroes, but also a more general sense of good standing for ordinary folk, was incredibly important in the relatively small, face-to-face societies of most Greek polis. The desire to maintain a good name and good relations with your fellow citizens was a powerful incentive for peaceful conduct. Public speaking and the art of rhetoric were highly valued, not just for swaying political assemblies, but also for persuading fellow citizens in legal and personal matters. The ability to articulate your case clearly and convincingly, to appeal to reason and emotion, was a key skill. This emphasis on words as tools of power and persuasion, rather than solely relying on physical force, is another indicator of a society that, at least in its ideals, preferred argument to aggression. Think of all those lengthy speeches recorded by historians like Thucydides. They are a testament to a culture that believed in the power of debate, even if those debates sometimes preceded less than peaceful outcomes. Historians still argue whether the Athenian legal system, with its reliance on citizen juries and often confrontational rhetoric, truly promoted justice and peace, or if it sometimes exacerbated divisions and led to unfair outcomes based on popularity or speaking skill rather than evidence. The famous trial and condemnation of Socrates is often cited as an example of the system's fallibility. However, for every controversial case, there were likely countless everyday disputes resolved, property rights upheld, and contracts enforced, contributing to the overall stability and predictability of life. Even in instances of more serious offenses, like homicide, the Greek approach, particularly in Athens, evolved over time from a system of private vengeance, the victim's family seeking retribution, towards a more public, legal process. While the family still had a role in prosecuting, the trial itself was a civic matter, aimed at restoring order and purity to the community, which was believed to be polluted by the shedding of kindred blood. So, while the image of the spear-wielding hoplite is iconic, it's equally important to remember the citizen scratching a name on an ostracan, the litigant carefully preparing their speech for the jury, or the neighbors choosing an arbitrator to settle a disagreement over a wandering goat. These are all instances of a society grappling with its internal conflicts and trying to find ways to resolve them that, more often than not, prioritized words, procedures, and communal well-being over swords and immediate retribution. This sophisticated toolkit for managing discord was a crucial, if less heralded, aspect of their surprisingly peaceful daily lives. We've journeyed through the quiet rhythms of your Greek home, the bustling peace of the agora, the joyful clamor of festivals, the serene pursuits of philosophy and art, and the ordered structures of civic life and conflict resolution. It might seem, after all this, that the ancient Greeks, despite their Hollywood reputation for epic battles, actually spent a good deal of their time just living. And in that living, there was a profound, if often unspoken, appreciation for peace itself. This wasn't just a passive absence of war, it was a positive value, something yearned for, celebrated, and even personified in their mythology. The embrace of Irene, the goddess of peace, offers a final, gentle lens through which to view the surprisingly peaceful currents in ancient Greek life. Irene, or Irene, as you might know her Roman equivalent, Pax, was one of the Ori, the goddesses of the seasons and the natural order of time, a daughter of Zeus and Themis, divine justice. Her very parentage links peace to divine order and lawful conduct. She was often depicted in art as a beautiful young woman, typically carrying a cornucopia, a horn of plenty, symbolizing prosperity and abundance, a scepter, or an olive branch, that universal symbol of peace which has resonated down through the millennia. Sometimes she was shown holding the infant Plutos, the god of wealth, underscoring the ancient understanding that peace and prosperity go hand in hand. When there is peace, agriculture can flourish, trade can thrive, and society can prosper. War, conversely, brings destruction, famine, and poverty. It's a pretty straightforward equation, and the Greeks got it. You would have encountered Irene not just as an abstract concept, but as a deity to be honored. While perhaps not having as many grand temples dedicated solely to her as, say, Zeus or Athena, altars and statues were erected in her name, particularly after periods of prolonged conflict when the longing for peace was most acute. A mainstream historical fact is that after a particularly draining war against Sparta, the Athenians, around 375 BCE, established a state cult for Irene and commissioned a famous bronze statue by the sculptor Cephisodotus, depicting Irene holding the infant Plutos. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a public declaration of the value they placed on peace and the prosperity it brought. Copies of this statue became widely known, a visual reminder of what they aspired to. Now for a quirky and rather lovely tidbit about the appreciation for peace. Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, wrote a play actually called Peace, Irene. In it, the main character, a frustrated Athenian farmer named Trygæus, literally flies to heaven on a giant dung beetle. Yes, you read that right. Greek comedy was wonderfully bizarre, to rescue the goddess Peace, who has been imprisoned by war. After various comical efforts, Peace is liberated, and her return to Earth brings an end to the Peloponnesian War, ushering in an era of feasting, farming, and general merrymaking. The play is a powerful anti-war statement, full of longing for the simple joys and abundance of peacetime. The fact that such a play was performed, and presumably enjoyed, at a major public festival like the city Dionysia, even during wartime, shows that the desire for peace was a potent and permissible public sentiment. You didn't have to be a hardened general to be a respected voice. Sometimes a farmer on a dung beetle could speak for the masses. This yearning for peace wasn't just an Athenian phenomenon. Across the Greek world, the cessation of hostilities was generally a cause for celebration. Treaties would be sworn with solemn oaths and sacrifices, often inscribed on stone stelae for public display, a tangible record of the commitment to end conflict. The Ekakyria, or Olympic truce, which we mentioned earlier, demonstrated a Panhellenic understanding that, at least for a time, the shared pursuit of athletic and cultural excellence should take precedence over interstate rivalries. It was a recognition that some things were more important than the endless cycle of grievances. Of course, the reality was often far from this ideal. Ancient Greece was frequently racked by wars, both internal and external. The independence of the numerous polis, while fostering a vibrant diversity of culture and political experimentation, also led to constant competition, alliances, and betrayals. Philosophers and historians grappled with the causes of war and the nature of justice between states. Thucydides, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, provides a stark and often pessimistic analysis of power politics. Historians still argue whether the Greek intellectual and artistic idealization of peace, like Aristophanes' play or statues of Irene, had a significant practical impact on the actual conduct of warfare or diplomacy, or if it was more of a comforting cultural counter-narrative to a harsh reality. It's probably a bit of both. The ideals may not have always prevented conflict, but they likely shaped the aspirations of many ordinary people and perhaps influenced the terms on which peace was eventually made. It provided a vocabulary and a set of symbols for expressing the desire to end fighting and return to normalcy. Imagine yourself, after a period of conflict or uncertainty, seeing a new altar dedicated to Irene, or hearing news that a peace treaty has finally been signed. The sense of relief, the hope for a return to the predictable rhythms of life, tending your fields, plying your trade, raising your family without the constant shadow of war, would be immense. This wasn't just an abstract political development, it would have a direct, tangible impact on your daily existence, on your ability to pursue all those quiet, peaceful activities we've explored. The very personification of peace as a goddess Irene suggests that it wasn't seen as a mere default state, but as a divine blessing, something to be actively sought, cherished, and protected. It was linked to order, justice, abundance, and the flourishing of human life. So, as you navigated your days in ancient Greece, amidst the pottery and the philosophy, the marketplaces and the festivals, the idea of peace, Irene, was more than just a word. It was a presence, a promise, a deeply held aspiration that underpinned the surprisingly peaceful, everyday lives of so many of its people. It was the gentle breeze that allowed the seeds of culture, community, and individual well-being to grow. And now, as our journey through the quieter avenues of ancient Greece draws to a close, let the images we've conjured settle gently in your mind. The soft light of dawn in a simple courtyard, the murmur of the agora, the scent of baking bread and wild thyme, the focused calm of an artist at their work, the shared laughter at a village festival, the thoughtful cadence of a philosophical discussion under an olive tree. These are the enduring whispers of a world that, for all its famed clamor of bronze and battle, also knew the profound and sustaining rhythms of peace. The daily lives we've glimpsed, full of their own small dramas, their routines, their moments of joy and quiet satisfaction, were the true bedrock of that ancient civilization. The grand narratives of heroes and empires are but the waves on the surface of a much deeper, steadier current, the current of ordinary people, tending to their homes, their crafts, their communities, and their gods, striving for a measure of harmony in their existence. Allow the sounds to fade now, the distant bleating of goats on a hillside, the clack of the loom, the gentle strumming of a lyre, let them become part of the quiet fabric of your own approaching rest. Feel the warmth of the Mediterranean sun on your skin, now a gentle memory, as the concerns of your day also begin to recede. The surprisingly peaceful lives of the ancient Greeks remind us that even in ages past, amidst challenges we can scarcely imagine, the human spirit sought and found tranquility in the everyday, in connection, in creation, and in the simple turning of the seasons. May you find your own quiet haven tonight.